Time now for the Sunday Talk. Tonight, the politics of stereotypes. After a long, heart-wrenching road, the Truth and Reconciliation Commission has issued its recommendations. For First Nations leaders, a chance for a fresh start at relations with the rest of Canada. But the Prime Minister's reaction has been muted. Changes often come from public pressure, and when it comes to public perceptions of First Nations, old thinking can run very deep.
Rid yourself of those racial stereotypes of Indians and Indigenous peoples being dumb and lazy and drunk on welfare. Rid yourself of those things so new things can come in.
New things like more efforts to reclaim a culture.
It's a privilege to be able to learn in our language.
Improving living conditions.
Okay, this is the pipes here. They run in from here.
Making waves on the Canadian music scene.
To be sampling powwow music and bringing it into clubs.
We're shown some Aboriginal success, but for many Canadians, it's against a backdrop of racial stereotypes that go back generations, from the mouths of politicians.
Maybe there's a tendency on the part of some people to allow the Indians to have too much, before they leave the beverage room or the bar.
Trying to find job opportunities for the Indians, such as perhaps getting back into craft making, souvenirs, and this type of thing that could be sold to the tourists.
Stereotypes of angry and violent natives that frighten communities.
I have 6-year-olds that are coming home who are terrified to go to sleep at night. We had to put new locks on our doors.
A litany of misery enforcing the image of a broken people, and a long history of native cultures reduced to caricatures.
She got reservation. You want reservation? Tilden Rent-A-Car fix quick.
Even now, it's not mandatory in high schools to teach what happened in residential schools. I'm joined by our panelists. Jonathan Kay is editor-in-chief at the Walrus magazine. John Moore is a talk radio host in Toronto. And our guest panelist tonight is Dawn Harvard. She's president of the Native Women's Association of Canada. So, Dawn, I really want to hear what it was like growing up. But because this is a panel, a discussion about attitudes held by non-Natives, I'm going to start with our regulars and come back to you in just a moment. So, John, growing up, what was your view, I guess, stereotypes, the attitudes that you were exposed to growing up?
Oh, I grew up in Montreal, and we weren't exposed, my family, my community, we weren't exposed to a lot of First Nations on a first-hand basis. What we got from school, where there was strong emphasis on sort of the noble savage idea, the stereotype from books. Also, the local Native reservations where you would go to get cheap cigarettes because there was a contraband. No, it's true, that was our main commercial connection with First Nations communities, was getting contraband cigarettes. And of course, you also had the stereotype of drunken First Nations people, which was in the media. And, you know, some of my friends, sometimes they go out west and they go to Edmonton or Calgary, and that's what they come back with.
John, what was it like for you?
Almost no exposure at all, which is odd, actually, because my grandmother was from Manitoulin, and we would go to Manitoulin, which is largely Native, in the summer, and we'd have no contact with Natives. We would go to Ganawage just to sort of drive around. I mean, I feel very fortunate. My parents never filled me with any negative stereotypes, but we really were never encouraged to get to know any Native people. In school, there was, I heard the owl call my name, and Jesse was a really nice, wise guy on the Beachcombers. But that was about it. And up until, as a reporter, I had to cover the Oka crisis, and I had to sit with Natives and talk about their history, and then I sat down and made a very, big decision that I would read everything I could get my hands on. Up until that point, though, nothing.
And yet you were taught about other human rights issues.
Absolutely, and it's something I keep coming back to, and especially moving forward after the Truth and Reconciliation process. We have kids reading the Book of Negroes in school, and we'll have them reading the Diary of Anne Frank, but we will never expose them to the Native residential schools.
So, Dawn, what was it like for you? And you've got kids now. What is it like today in terms of stereotypes, views of non-Natives towards people like you?
Well, actually, it's interesting because, obviously, I'm not as stereotypically dark as most Natives, and because my father is non-Native. But I was often subjected to the kinds of things other people would say about First Nations people because they didn't realize that there was somebody that was First Nations in the room with them. So the kinds of things that people wouldn't dare say elsewhere, I was often privy to hearing a lot of, negative, that the Native students, they don't try as hard, or, how can we don't want to put too much pressure on them because they just aren't going to do as well as the other students. And you would hear these things, teachers saying them as we're walking down the halls. and for them not realizing. And even the small school I went to on Manitoulin Island, which is, you know, interesting that around the same area, and it has a huge First Nations population on Manitoulin, very, very strong Aboriginal culture on the island. So that you had been there and not had that exposure, you know, is very telling how, in fact, the majority of Canadians try very hard not to be exposed to Aboriginal people. I mean, we can be 5 minutes from a First Nation and not realize that First Nations peoples, many communities are living in third world conditions because we quite simply just don't go there, because as Canadians, we don't want to think about that. So,
and what do you think, John, talking about how you're taught about civil rights movements or other human rights, but in school, like, that was never taught. What had happened to the abuse, the residential schools, all of that, that was never taught when you were kids, but you have kids in school now. Are they being taught that? What are they being taught?
Well, actually, and it's even my oldest daughter, when she was in kindergarten, I remember her coming home with her little reading bag, and she had this book about Johnny Appleseed and about how brave Johnny Appleseed was to go out into the wilds where it was full of, you know, wild mountain lions and bears and Indians, and there was this picture of the mountain lion and the bear and the Indian man, you know, like this over the side of the bushes against, you know, poor brave Johnny Little Appleseed. And I had to go to the teacher and say, you know, this isn't appropriate. And she said, but this is a classic. The children love it. And I said, but that's exactly the problem, that you are perpetuating this by doing that. And even just last week, in fact, my middle daughter came home with her complaints about a video that they had shown in her classroom. And again, I called the principal, and they said, you know, but this is an NFB classic. It was on the board list. When I looked it up, it was from 1964. So maybe it was a classic, but that movie is older than I am. And so it still has those attitudes. But that's what people were comfortable with. But my daughter spoke up. You know, she had the nerve to come forward and speak out about it. And that's something that we're finding is very new in this generation, that, especially with the residential school experience.
So, John, you've sort of said that there was some either not caring or some ignorance. I would just wonder, now that we've been hearing so much about murdered and missing women, Indigenous women, and obviously truth and reconciliation recommendations, do you think things will change now?
Well, things I think are already changing. My daughters are fairly young. They're about 9 years old and 11 years old, and they are actually learning more up-to-date materials in schools, more culturally sensitive materials. So I think things have changed in schools. My fear is that there's another stereotype which is being created now, which is the Aboriginal as eternal victim of white racism. So if you look at the narrative that comes from murdered and missing Aboriginal women, the way it's covered in the news media, the way the TRC report has been covered, and the actual content of the preliminary TRC report, there is sometimes a simplistic narrative, which is that of Aboriginals as perennial victim. And that, too, can be a pernicious stereotype, I think, because it takes away the idea that First Nations peoples can prosper in mainstream Canadian society.
So it's not a good idea to learn about all the horrible things that happen?
I think it's a good idea to learn about these things, but you know, Jeff Simpson had a very good column in the Globe and Mail where he said you should never make this a dominant obsession of society to the point that you're convincing people that they are eternal victims. Because once you convince them of that, how are you going to get progress?
But I think also you need an acknowledgement, and it has to be more than the Prime Minister standing in the House, which I think was one of Stephen Harper's greatest moments. The Truth and Reconciliation process...
When he apologized.
Yeah, when he apologized to Natives. I think it was 2007, 2008.
And Chrétien also apologized, and Brian Mulroney also had the commission.
Here's one of the key differences. In South Africa, when they had Truth and Reconciliation, they actually had the perpetrators come forward and ask for forgiveness. And our process has been just to document a lot of terrible stories. And I can tell you...
Will it change anything?
Well, as a host of a talk radio show, if you tune into a talk radio show on Canadian radio and you start talking about Natives, the calls and the texts will come in about how we've spent too much on them, they cost too much, they've got to get off the reservation. The whole lazy, drunk, criminal aspect comes up. So I think we can have a very nice, costed conversation amongst smart columnists and smart people. But when you open the lines and you talk to people, and when you look at survey results from Ipsos Reid, where I think it was 81% said we have to cut off the reservations from their money until they get an audit. Nobody said that about the Senate. But we've said that about Natives.
I even heard something this week on Twitter where people were comparing the residential schools to, oh, like, just suck it up. It's like a boarding school.
Yeah, and even this attitude that, you know, or that it's in the past. You know, get over it already. It's not a big deal. It's just like the boarding schools that my dad attended in Scotland or Ireland.
It was well-intentioned.
And it was well-intentioned. And I mean, but all of the proof now shows that that's just not simple. It's not true. It was not well-intentioned. It was deliberate cultural genocide. They tried to eliminate the peoples.
I'm going to push back on that, because when people use words like genocide, the the image that comes to mind is the Nazi Holocaust. This absolutely unmitigated evil, people trying to exterminate a whole race of people. And I think the least that could be said about the residential school project, as misguided and often brutal as it was, is that the idea of integrating First Nations people in mainstream Canadian society is not in itself an evil one. You could say the way
I don't think that was actually the idea of the residential school system,
because when you
though.
use genocide, you're comparing it to
Even the government documents from the time demonstrate that they themselves said that educating First Nations people to be able to compete with white people was never the intention of the residential school system. It was specifically designed to eliminate the language, the culture, which effectively eliminates our peoples as a people.
I don't think we're going to resolve whether there was a genocide here, cultural or otherwise, tonight. But I'm just, Dawn, do you get a sense now that people, in general, that Canadians are changing that the old stereotypes might get swept away? Do you have hope?
I do have hope. I mean, I think there are still a lot of people, like you said, from past generations who, they are the ones who are making the calls. It's amazing how the more ignorant people are, the louder they are. And yet I do have hope for the next generations coming forward that are, the results of the schools have a lot of, our kids are there all day, every day. That's where they're learning a lot of their values and their opinions. And so I have hope that, in 20, 30 years, things may be different, but absolutely, right now, there is still so much racism out there for our people. With missing and murdered women, how many of those families heard, that's just one less prostitute on my beat, that's just one less welfare check?
I'll bring you in, John, and then one last point to you, John.
Well, I just think, look at the Prime Minister setting the tone this week, which is to be largely indifferent, even though he's been very compassionate in the past. And I think for mainstream Canadians, they're not interested in acknowledging what happened before. They're tired of the conversation. They want to move on. So the kids can be brought up and taught about this, and kids are compassionate, and that'll change things over time. But I think it's a wash with the rest of the population. They're tired of the conversation.
I think educating people has to be about telling them what happened in the past, not hiding from that, but at the same time teaching people that they can overcome what happened in the past too, that they have agency, that they're empowered, and that Canada is not an irredeemably racist society, that we can change and that we will change.
Well, and I think, that's the one thing that we don't ever want to see First Nations people, Aboriginal people, as only victims. And that's where media plays a huge role. The only time you see First Nations people or Aboriginal people in the media is when they're going to jail, when they've done something wrong. And we don't have those positive stories, those success stories. And that's the kind of thing that can make a difference, absolutely.
So much more to talk about here, but we are out of time. Thanks so much, all of you.